This episode of How Is This a Thing is brought to you by the letter S. The letter immediately after S is the first letter of the first name of a man who seemingly can no longer be mentioned on Facebook anymore. And the letter immediately before S is the first letter of his second name. If you switch these two letters around, you get Romy Toppinson. And apparently Romy is facing a new contempt of court hearing in the police state known as the United Kingdom. This article is from the BBC. Last May, he was given a 13-month jail sentence for filming and live streaming footage outside of a trial that you're probably very much aware of. He was released on bail in August, pending new proceedings at the Old Bailey. The 35-year-old, whose real name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, why are you dead-naming him? That's totally hate or whatever, could be sent back to jail if he is again found in contempt. A statement from the Attorney General's office said Mr. Cox had reached his decision based on an assessment of the evidence and whether it was in the wider public interest. That Mr. Cox is the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, by the way. There's no doubt that he's become a major thorn in the side of the political and media establishment in Britain. It's not hard to reach the conclusion that someone wants to get him out of the way. The thing is, all they end up doing is making him a martyr. On the subject of the UK, Theresa May recently said the following.
Next week, members of Parliament in Westminster face a crucial choice: whether to back the Brexit deal or to reject it. Back it, and the UK will leave the European Union. Reject it, and no one knows what will happen. We may not leave the EU for many months. We may leave without the protections that the deal provides. We may never leave at all.
I don't know why, but given how poorly Theresa May has handled the Brexit negotiations, a paranoid person might suspect that not leaving the EU is what the political establishment in Britain wanted all along. Why even suggest it if they actually truly cared about the democratic will of the British people? I just can't put my finger on why I find myself thinking this way. I just don't know why I get that impression. It's almost as if turning the entire Brexit saga into an excruciatingly painful and drawn-out process that still hasn't been resolved 2.5 years later was all part of the plan. To either derail Britain's exit completely or serve as a massive deterrent for other EU nations thinking of leaving this Soviet-style Hotel California superstate. Oh, and would you look at that? EU President, UK's experience of leaving EU will serve as a deterrent to others. This article is from Breitbart. European Parliament President Antonio Tajani has said that the experiences of Britain attempting to leave the EU will serve as a deterrent to other nations considering leaving the bloc.
It's almost as if that was part of the plan all along.
Speaking to Germany's Morgenpost, the Italian politician was asked whether after nearly 3 years since the referendum and months of negotiation with obstructive bureaucrats in Brussels, he believed other Eurosceptic member states would be inspired by the UK to leave the bloc. I think that's impossible, Mr. Tajani told the Berlin Daily. The example of the British will serve as a deterrent. We have to change the European Union, but we have to stay together. Yeah, we have to stay together, no matter what, right? Even if the majority of the British electorate wanted to leave, sorry, your EU masters have spoken, you have to stay in the Union, and Britain will be made to look like an object lesson for the rest of the member states thinking of leaving. Why do the EU bureaucrats remind me of Kathy Bates's character from Misery? Saying that he would be very happy if the British people stayed in the EU, he maintained that Brussels would remain inflexible on Prime Minister Theresa May's withdrawal agreement and would only grant an extension to Article 50 if the UK gave a reason, suggesting a new election or a new referendum. But otherwise, the current impasse would not be eased by the bloc. That's their problem, not ours, Mr. Tajani said. Ah yes, good old elitist contempt for the democratic voice of the people, I see. At least they're consistent. The hardline position of the EU appears to be working. Breitbart London reported in February that the Eurosceptic populist Sweden Democrats Party, set to double their vote share in the May European Parliament EP elections, has backed off from supporting a public vote on leaving the EU after observing the way Brussels has treated London. Clearly, the EU does its utmost to complicate Britain's departure, party leader Jimmy Åkesson said last month, adding, it would be irresponsible for Sweden to leave before knowing how it goes with Britain. And I suspect this is the reason nationalist political parties in the likes of Italy, Austria, Hungary and Poland are in no hurry to call for a referendum on EU membership. Though in the long run, the right decision might be to simply weaken the EU's authority by refusing to comply with the demands of Brussels on a whole host of issues. The Eastern European countries seem to be far better at saying no to Brussels than the likes of my own country, for example, where Irish politicians are effectively yes men to the EU. It is a consistent message from the EU's bureaucrats and European politicians, with German former diplomat Thomas Matusek, probably not pronouncing that correctly, admitting in November 2017 that Brussels is aiming for a Brexit which is as soft as possible, but a Brexit which is as hard as necessary in order to discourage others to follow the British example, mainly to try to have the cake and eat it, which we wouldn't allow. You have to love the sheer honesty of such authoritarian arrogance. Imagine trying to get a divorce from your wife or husband, and they won't even let you leave the house. They hold you captive. That's what this feels like. While in March 2017, in the same month, the EU triggered the 2-year Article 50 procedure, President of the European Commission Jean-Claude Juncker said it would make the Brexit process so difficult that it would deter other states from leaving the bloc, saying they will all see from the UK's example that leaving the EU is a bad idea. Almost sounds like some kind of intimidation tactic, doesn't it? Actually, I think this will only embolden nationalist sentiment further by finding other means of undermining EU control of member states. The British people are now locked in a struggle for freedom against powerful bureaucratic and anti-democratic forces in their own country and in Brussels, and there's one thing that most people the world over can always get behind: an underdog's fight for freedom. Brexit will happen eventually in some form because the EU's collapse is just a matter of time. Moving on, Australian government backs down on banning Milo Yiannopoulos after backlash. Milo Yiannopoulos, who says things that offend certain people of a delicate disposition, was initially banned from entering a so-called developed and free nation, in a similar manner to the permanent banning of Lauren Southern from the UK. People are being banned from social networks for triggering algorithms. Now they're getting banned from entire countries for expressing political views that the establishment don't like. How is this a thing? This article is from stuff.co.nz. The Australian government has backed down on banning right-wing speaker Milo Yiannopoulos from entering the country amid a backlash of MPs and conservative media commentators. In a stark change of position from just 4 days ago, the government is now distancing itself from a Department of Home Affairs letter which outlined a series of reasons why the controversial figure may not pass the character test and should not be allowed into the country. Okay, so I guess this is good news, but it's disturbing that a person can be banned from a country because a small minority of certain people complain, despite the fact that Milo doesn't pose any physical threat to anyone in Australia. The department also listed a series of controversial statements Yiannopoulos has made about Muslims, Indigenous Australians, African Americans, and the LGBTIQ community, and included copies of 19 news articles or screenshots where he was accused of offensive behaviour, including anti-Semitism. Senior members of the government were earlier this week satisfied with the decision to block Yiannopoulos from returning to Australia for a speaking tour in 2019, but Immigration Minister David Coleman will now personally approve the visa. A government source said Coleman strongly disagreed with many of Yiannopoulos' views and statements, but had reached the view that someone should not be banned because people disagree with him and may protest in response. Well done, Mr. Coleman. Sanity prevails down under in the end. I want to conclude this episode by talking again about the Joe Rogan podcast episode where Tim Pool grilled Twitter representatives Vijay Gadde and Jack Dorsey. In my video on that last week, I said something that I'm now going to take back. I said that I appreciated them at least sitting down and talking to Tim and agreeing to have a civilized discussion. And then over the past few days, I've had time to think about it, and I've realized that I was wrong. Twitter is a privately owned public commons. The company's policies are undermining the First Amendment rights of US citizens, and indeed the free speech of people around the world. These companies have the power to undermine democracy. The least that Jack Dorsey and the like can do is sit down and explain themselves. I would actually argue it is their obligation to justify their actions given the enormous power that their platforms have in controlling public discourse and influencing our societies. In my opinion, all they're doing is sitting there trying to justify their censorship policies and hate speech policies while denying that they clearly have a bias. Hate speech is protected speech under US law, and therefore, if Twitter is determining what content and what voices are permitted to speak on its platform, then they are a publisher and should be treated as such. They're not owed a pat on the back just because they don't understand this. That concludes this episode of How Is This a Thing? Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.